Testing, testing. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I do see the record button. It's on.
Yes, we're still having an issue with the connection to the Granicus system. There's no sound being transmitted to the public at this time.
Got it.
Well, is it, I mean, I'm tempted to postpone this meeting, but what's the realistic, are we close to getting this fixed, or is it going to be a while?
I just received word that we've established a connection.
Okay. Sorry, man. It's just close to but if we can get it to work right now, we'll go with it.
Okay, so as of now, I am reconvening the meeting in Granicus. And public comment, are you there, Cecilia?
Yes, I'm here, and I will admit everyone into the room. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
My name is Fong Bui and I represent SPIN. I'd like to speak on item 1, please.
You have 1 minute.
We want to thank DOT for moving the permanent program in the right direction by creating a framework focused on equity and accountability. We support moving forward without delay with the removal of price cap and Lock 2 requirements. We think that equity should be tied to people and not zones. For example, rider subsidies could be based on income, then price caps could be replaced by a requirement that a percentage of rides be from low-income users. DC, for example, currently uses a similar structure. In LA, during Safer at Home, usage of SPIN's discount equity program, which is rider-specific, doubled to about 30% of total rides. And secondly, on Lock 2 technology, we don't yet have the infrastructure for users from many neighborhoods to be a walking distance to bike racks. And that lack of infrastructure will create an extra barrier to the adoption of a more sustainable, congestion-reducing mode of transportation. Again, we support moving the framework forward as we work with DOT and your offices to fine-tune. Thanks for your consideration.
Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Hi, this is Tim Alborg from SPIN. I want to speak on item 1.
You have 1 minute.
Thank you. My name is Tim Alborg. I'm head of government partnerships for SPIN. Speaking on item 1, and SPIN believes the proposed framework before you today moves the dockless mobility program in the right direction. It has a workable structure to expand equity and ensure accountability. SPIN is supportive of moving forward without delay with the following changes. We request that the city remove requirements for Lock 2 technology and price caps of $1.75 or less. Unlike public transit, SPIN does not rely on public subsidies to fund our services. We believe that now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when people need more transportation options that allow for social distancing, SPIN can fill transportation gaps created by reduced public transit capacity. We support moving forward today with LIDOT's framework for more accountability, stronger equity goals in the permanent program, but we urge Council to remove the price cap and Lock 2 requirements so that SPIN can continue to operate in LA and provide sustainable mobility options for all city residents. Thank you.
Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Elise Swanson, San Pedro Chamber of Commerce, item number 1.
You have 1 minute.
The San Pedro Chamber supports programs that increase transit options for our residents and visitors. Dockless bikes and scooters are important components as we work to promote options for quick trips in town and the last mile. Our chamber is a satellite office for Discover LA, and we are also a Metro Tap Card vendor. We do a lot of trip planning, and so we know firsthand how difficult it can be for both residents and visitors to travel throughout San Pedro and all of Los Angeles. Micromobility can be a key transportation component of an overall transit plan. When we had scooters here in San Pedro, we saw firsthand how they were used to assist with short trips and trips between bus routes and stops. We are asking, however, for a delay of implementing this framework and the new rules and guidelines to allow for San Pedro, for a discussion of San Pedro being included in the mobility equity zone. Our community needs investment in transportation, especially due to the fact that we are at the southernmost tip of Los Angeles, and we do not have many transportation options in our community that are available in other parts of the city. Thank you for your consideration.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Hi there. My name is Sal Nisan, and I'd like to speak on item number 1.
You have 1 minute.
First off, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to allow me to speak today. Like I said, my name is Sal. I live in Mid-Wilshire, where I've lived for about 3 years now. And I'm asking the council to reconsider the program because of how it will deeply impact not only the people that work in the space, but our customers and community. This new program will dramatically change the way scooters are distributed through the city. It will really affect how people move around and certainly encourage folks to go back to using cars, which we don't want. I'm also deeply concerned with how the new program will impact my ability to make money. I've been paying off my debt, and it's definitely affected in that regard. LA is a leader has been an innovator of ideas and solutions, especially with this whole scooter thing. And I think this would undo a whole lot of work towards getting people out of cars. Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
My name is Sam Sandel with Lime, and I would like to speak on item 1.
You have 1 minute.
Thanks. First, I'd like to thank the chair and the committees, and I'd like to thank LA Department of Transportation for your partnership over the past year. As you can see from the 1-year snapshot, the micromobility program has really changed and matured, and while we've accomplished a lot of things that were unimaginable when it started, the industry has a ways to go to create a program that works for all Angelinos. That said, to accomplish the city's goals while ensuring micromobility companies continue to feasibly operate is a conversation with LA DOT that has not yet taken place. And unfortunately, the proposal before you today would likely end the micromobility program as we know it, not improve upon it. As you can see in the letter submitted by Lime, Lyft, Bird, and Wheels, we're calling for a 6-month extension of the program to allow LA DOT to work with providers to collaboratively examine the report, identify areas for improvement, test various approaches, and create a permanent system that meets and exceeds the priorities for the city. Thank you very much, and we're always available if you have any questions about micromobility.
Thank you. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Good afternoon. This is Clara Carger with Central City Association, and I'd like to speak on item 1.
You have 1 minute.
The LA Chamber also wishes to associate with these remarks, but we remain advocates of innovative mobility options like dockless scooters and bikes that reduce our reliance on cars and support our region's bus and rail network by providing first-last mile solutions. We wish to recognize the City Council for moving forward with the next phase of this program, as well as LA DOT's priorities of equity, safety, environmental resilience, and an open marketplace. To achieve these goals, we ask that you delay implementation and continue the existing program to allow for further collaboration between the city, the industry, and the community. If this committee wishes to act on the program today, we ask you to reconsider the proposal that vehicles be equipped with Lock 2 devices, as well as streamline industry requirements, including creating a standard per trip fee to create certainty during this difficult economic period. Micromobility is still a developing industry, and the second phase of this program should advance the City Council's priorities while ensuring that operators can still feasibly conduct business in our city. Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Hello. Item number 1. My name is Danielle Sandoval.
Okay.
My name is Danielle Sandoval. I'm the president for the Harbor City Neighborhood Council. I read the report submitted by LADOT, and it is unfortunate that CD15 is not included in the maps that were created for disadvantaged communities or equity zones. Some of the data that was acquired in late 2019 according to the report, and during that phase, scooters and bikes were not in our community. They were removed from our city streets without any explanation. Therefore, how can a report be determined whether or not there is a need in our district? Therefore, the proposed equity zones will not encourage micromobility in the communities that need it the most. Harbor City and the surrounding communities want and need micromobility options like dockless scooters and bikes. It reduces traffic and pollution and encourages physical outdoor exercise. When the bikes and scooters were delivered to our newly renovated park in the community was so excited. I started to see families riding them around the park and around town. When they suddenly disappeared, I started getting phone calls and emails. I couldn't give any explanation. It has become very apparent that micromobility is a necessity in my community. And I'm respectfully requesting that you ask LADOT to deploy bikes and scooters in CD15 and update the report before you consider this motion. Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
My name is Ann Carpenter. I'm CEO of Braid Theory. I would be speaking on item number 1. In addition to my role as a private company, I'm also wearing a hat of Chief Innovation Officer for CD15, and we are tasked with growing the Blue Economy Innovation Hub in San Pedro and the LA Harbor area. Like previous callers, I wish to support the efforts to continue to bring micromobility to Los Angeles, but feel very strongly that it's important to support areas in CD15, particularly the LA Harbor area, because we do not have the density to encourage these companies to do it on their own. Like what happened in downtown LA and Silicon Beach, if we grow the entrepreneur community here, it's good for the entire city. Micromobility is a key component to that. The Cal Enviro screen and federal opportunity zones are perfectly good indicators to show the need of the socioeconomic disadvantaged communities that are in and around the harbor area. Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Jamie Gailey, item 1.
1 minute.
Good morning, LA City Council. My name is Jamie, and I would like to thank you for allowing me to speak today. I am concerned that the program being proposed today will negatively impact the micromobility industry and will set us backward in our city's efforts to create sustainable initiatives for the environment through the reduction of traffic and carbon emissions. I've lived here in Venice for 13 years now and have seen firsthand how great the micromobility movement has been for reducing traffic and parking congestion. I also work within the same industry and will be deeply impacted if this program goes through as is. With the income I generate, I am able to help feed homeless people in Venice and support the community. Since I was a child, my parents taught me to dedicate 10% of my earnings towards helping those in need and building up the community. If we are hit with these regulations, not only am I afraid that I won't be able to help contribute back to the community, I am worried that I will have to look for other alternatives altogether. I hope during this time of economic hardship for so many that you will reconsider the program to ensure that members of the micromobility workforce who support a greener future and who regularly give back to the community are still able to continue earning a living this way. Thank you.
Thank you. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Kenya, item 1.
1 minute, please. Go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, City Councilman. I would thank for the opportunity to talk. My name is Kenya. I'm here in North Hollywood. I've been here for 22 years. And let me tell you, this scooter changed my life and better because I have a special needs kid, and my husband with disability. And then I have to be the head of the family. That's so hard for me, the opportunity to work. When that opportunity appeared in my life changed, I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be part of this. Please reconsider this program and how it will affect a family like mine, who are doing this very today for this change. Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Hi, my name is Marissa Rodriguez-McGill with LIST, and I would like to speak on the first item.
1 minute.
Good afternoon, council members. Thank you so much for your time. Again, my name is Marissa Rodriguez-McGill. I'm a Senior Public Policy Manager for the LIST Transit Bike and Scooter team in Southern California. In the last year, dockless mobility companies provided almost 15 million trips in Los Angeles. We're providing crucial first, last mile connections, filling transportation gaps, and helping reduce the number of short trips taken in cars. Over the last few months, Los Angeles has taken unprecedented steps to relax restrictions and requirements for local industries, and this has helped businesses survive during the COVID crisis. Restaurants can set up tables and serve patrons on our sidewalks and in parking lots. Taxi cabs can pick up passengers curbside at LAX, and taxi franchise agreements have been extended. Through the council's smart actions, you've helped some businesses survive, keep people employed, and our economy moving. However, the draft rules and guidelines that were released by LADOT just a few weeks ago are not the path forward that we need to create a more permanent shared micromobility program in Los Angeles. As a partner to the city, we feel that LADOT's draft rules and guidelines do not adequately incorporate shared micromobility operator feedback or the concerns that we have voiced over the past year.
Caller, your time is up.
Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Tim Harder, item 1.
1 minute.
Good afternoon, council members. I would like to speak on item number 1. My name is Tim Harder, Senior Manager of Government Partnerships at Bird. I would like to start. Thank you to LADOT city staff for compiling this report on the dockless pilot program. I'm calling to express our concern with the proposed regulations before you today. Due to the pandemic, cities across the U.S. have extended their pilot programs. Neighboring Santa Monica recently extended their pilot program by 12 months and moved to a per-trip fee to ensure sustainable micromobility operations throughout the pandemic. We are seeing new trends in the past few months as more people are trying scooters for the first time and are becoming repeat riders. This is likely a result of factors including the need to socially distance, a reluctance to be in confined spaces, and a reduced demand on public transportation to accommodate local trips. We ask that the current pilot program be extended for 6 months and that a working group be formed, including operators, so we can work closely with community stakeholders and LADOT to discuss the staff proposed recommendations. You can find the joint letter from the industry and a letter from Bird's CEO attached in your packet. Thank you for your consideration.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Todd Marin, item number 1.
1 minute.
Thank you, council members. My name is Todd Marin. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Wheels, a micromobility company based in West Hollywood. I, too, would like to advocate in favor of an extension of the program. I want to thank the LADOT for their consideration of all the issues impacting micromobility, and we totally agree that there are many ways that the program can be improved, even though it is going extremely well right now. But the problem with the current proposals is that it would have a dramatic impact on the operators, both in terms of finances and operations. And given the instability caused by the pandemic, this is the wrong time to be making such fundamental changes that are going to dramatically impact the operator's ability to provide this necessary service to Los Angelinos. And I'm very confident that if we have a little time to engage with the city, we will be able to meet all of their objectives, but we just need that opportunity. So I would appreciate an extension of the program, and I thank you for your consideration.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. Caller, please
Hello?
state your name. Yes.
Yes, hi. This is Chuck Krolikowski. I'd like to speak on item number 9, if that's you're taking that right now.
You have 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Chuck Krolikowski. I'm legal counsel for 722 to 728 South Broadway with respect to item number 9, which deals with the street vacation along Vermont Avenue and 85th. I previously submitted 2 letters in February. I submitted additional letters yesterday, as well as an entire deposition transcript of Mr. Edmund Yu, and I wanted to confirm that that was part of the record on this item. But the thrust of the objections is that we're trying to figure out exactly what project the city is trying to process here. Is the city trying to process a simple street vacation application, or is the city trying to process a larger project? The larger project in this matter is a 400,000 square foot mixed-use project being proposed by the County of Los Angeles and other developers, which includes large sections of residential components, commercial components, etc., which would not qualify for any type of categorical exemption under CEQA. For a project of this size, even piecemealing the street vacation portion of it, it should comply with CEQA in terms of processing an initial study that is complete enough to analyze whether further environmental review should be adopted, such as a negative declaration, an MND, or a full EIR. So we object to the piecemealing of this project. We object to the city's determination that a categorical exemption should apply, and we request that this commission deny the street vacation application or recommend its denial, and or refuse to adopt any type of categorical exemption for a project that needs more environmental review. Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Kevin Hernandez, item 1.
You have 1 minute.
Good afternoon, City Hall Council. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As again, my name is Kevin Hernandez. I live in Sawtell. My family and I have lived in Los Angeles for over 30 years, and I'm very proud to call this city home. When scooters first hit the street a few years back, I was excited to earn income while being a student to help pay my bills. I am calling today to urge the city council to consider how these rules would affect people like me who work in the industry. This program has limitations that will have serious impact on my ability to continue to pay my way through college, rent, and bills. I help cover with my family. I hope the city will postpone new rules and consider the impact they will have on working families throughout Los Angeles. Thank you.
Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. Caller is not responsive. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. This caller is also not responsive. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Hello, my name is Christian Guzman, and I would like to speak to item number 1.
You have 1 minute.
I am an avid bicyclist, and before the pandemic, took a lot of public transportation. Since the pandemic happened, I'm a little bit scared of taking public transportation. I think that if there were more dockless bicycles and scooters, that more people would want to utilize those now and after the pandemic. I would also want to use it on hot days when riding my bicycle would make me work up a sweat, and it'd be able to keep me cool if I could zip along on one of those scooters. I really would like to see Wilmington and San Pedro included in an equity zone. I think that Wilmington definitely could utilize the scooters and bicycles more, and I'd like to see that.
Thank you. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Hello, yes, this is Max Shorty, and I'd like to speak on item 1.
You have 1 minute.
Yes, this is Max Shorty, former commissioner for the city of Los Angeles, also a commissioner for the state of California, Assembly District 64, and Senate District 35. I'm calling in behalf of Watts. I think now is the time that Watts be included. We have been excluded for so long from projects like this. And as our fellow council members know, that we're in a rebuilding stage right now. And the community would greatly benefit from something like this. Our young and our elderly people. Because it's time for us to be able to have access to the things the rest of the city has and not be excluded. So the time for change is now. The time is to bring mobility to the city of Watts, California. Thank you.
Thank you. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on. This caller is not responsive. Caller, please state your name and what item you would like to speak on.
Hi, my name is James. I'd like to speak. I've got public comment. We've got the vending program that issued a permit to somebody who's operating in front of a school, and under your rules and regulations, it says that that is prohibited. They said because the school is closed that he could operate there. He has a permit, from what I understand. This is what the investigators are telling me. I need some clarification because I don't see anything on there that says if the schools are closed that he could operate. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes public comment.
Great, thank you. Just for the callers, for questions like that, we can't legally, because of the Brown Act, get in a back and forth with folks, but that's the kind of question you should call your council office and they can help resolve for you. Great, so that brings us, before we move to item 1, what I'd like to do is take item 2, which is a joint committee item on consent, as well as to move item 5, 6, 8 through 10, and item 4, but item 4 with an amendment to amend the motion to include Rec and Parks and City Planning to the list of departments requested to report. So with that, I'd like to ask for a roll call vote on moving on consent those items 2, 5, 6, 8 through 10, and 4 as amended. And first we'll have a vote of the Public Works Committee, and then we'll be following that with a vote by the Transportation Committee. The Transportation Committee will only be voting on item 2. So if you could call the roll for these consent items, unless there's objection from any committee member. But seeing none and hearing none, if you could call the roll for those consent items, please.
Okay, for the Public Works Committee to take on consent, item 2, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 4 and 7 as indicated by the chair. Blumenfield.
Blumenfield, aye.
Rue.
Aye.
Buscaino.
Buscaino, aye.
O'Farrell.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Thank you. And now a vote for item number 2 only on consent by the Transportation Committee. Bonin.
Aye.
Buscaino.
Buscaino, aye.
Correct.
Aye.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All items have been approved.
I'm sorry, that was on mute. That brings us to item 1. If you could please read that one into the record.
Item 1 is the Los Angeles Department of Transportation report relative to an evaluation of the 1-year dockless on-demand personal mobility pilot program.
Thank you. So what we have, folks, is an extensive report that's going to take the dockless mobility program from a pilot program to a permanent program. I want to invite Salita Reynolds and Jarvis Murray from the Department of Transportation to provide an overview of the major changes. But before I do that, I want to give Mr. Bonin, who is co-chairing this as a Transportation Committee chair. Someone just said goodbye, but goodbye whoever it is. And Mr. Bonin, do you want to say any introductory remarks before we have our presentation?
Just real brief, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to DOT for the work and for staff for coming up. I'll have more questions later, but just wanted to frame this for a second. I look forward to the day, hopefully soon, where we are not revisiting the issue of scooters in either T or Public Works Committee, and we just get a program on paper in place and have LADOT implementing it. But there's been so much history here. You know, scooters landed on LA streets without any warning, without any rules in place, and we have had to scramble to respond to this disruptive technology. And by way of intro, I just want to say I think LADOT has done an excellent job in seeing the opportunity that these devices have presented for achieving our mobility and our environmental goals, while thinking long-term about how we should regulate potentially disruptive new technologies on our streets, and at least in the case of the scooters when they launched, our sidewalks. And so I just want to, as we do this discussion and cue up the presentation, I just want to note that this proposed program that they're working on here is not just a framework for scooters. I mean, that's how this is viewed today, really much broader. It's a roadmap for implementing regulations on all kinds of new potential technologies, from drones to AVs to TNCs, if we ever get that authority from the state, which we need. And we need to ensure that this framework works citywide and anticipates the future, because it is our toolkit so that we don't get caught blindsided by the next hot thing, because tech moves a lot faster than we do. So this is an opportunity to be thoughtful, proactive, and global. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Bonin, and couldn't agree more. So thank you for that, and thank you, Ms. Reynolds and Murray, for being here, and thank you have in and our in on this issue. So with that, the floor is yours, and take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for making time for the Joint Committee, and it's really nice to see y'all. I don't see you very much anymore except for on Zoom, but I appreciate the opportunity to come and address you. And these two committees in particular are comprised of some of the leaders on this issue across. It's a very, it covers a lot of ground, whether it's about data or privacy or sidewalk riding or parking or disruptive technologies and venture capitalists. Really, scooters have it all. And we issued our first, we opened our first conditional permit program actually in November of 2018. So we've been at this now for almost 2 years, and we've learned quite a lot. And the things that we've learned are, first of all, we have some great partners and some great companies, local companies and California companies that are really trying to change the way that people get around, and they've been great partners in innovating and iterating. We've learned that Angelinos really want different choices. They want other ways to get around the city. And we've also learned that you cannot necessarily rely completely on private companies to put their time, effort, energy, and resources into meeting public policy goals. And the two places where we've struggled quite a bit are the ones that you're hearing from the companies on now. One of those is around equity. And you'll recall that the first go-round we used the Cal EnviroScreen disadvantaged communities. And what we gave the companies was a basket of carrots. We said, here are a ton of incentives on what we want to see you do to really serve the city equitably. And we didn't get there. Just being very plain spoken and direct, there was not really a shared deep commitment to achieve those equity outcomes. And so we went back to the drawing board and we tried to do two things. First, we added a few very small sticks to our basket of carrots to actually put in requirements. If you want access to the most trip-rich, hottest scooter neighborhoods in this city, then you have to serve the neighborhoods that maybe cost you more money to serve because they're farther away and you have to stretch your operations or whatever the case may be. And we also took a finer look at the neighborhoods we really wanted to make sure that companies would deploy. Because what was happening is that companies looked at the Cal EnviroScreen map and deployed in neighborhoods that met the Cal EnviroScreen requirements but were right next to very trip-rich neighborhoods. So they were able to get access to some of those trip-rich neighborhoods without really serving the parts of the city that we want them to serve most urgently. And many of those touch all of your districts. And so we tried to come back with a program that sort of took our role as regulator with a little bit more muscle. And the second big issue that we struggled with was sidewalk clutter and just the general sort of disorganized or chaotic feeling in certain parts of the city where there was oversaturation. And so we attacked that in two different ways. One is we worked with Councilmember Bonin and O'Farrell on establishing special operations zones that have very specific requirements in the most saturated parts of the city to try and keep the access for people without impeding everybody's need to get around the sidewalk. And the second thing you heard about pushback a lot from the companies was the implementation of a Lock 2 requirement phased in by March of next year. So other cities, including San Francisco, our neighbor to the north, have included Lock 2 requirements that have resulted in drastic improvements on sidewalk clutter, sidewalk chaos, and generally a lot of the things that we hear from your constituents about and you hear from your constituents about. So this is not a requirement that we're putting in overnight, but we are trying to send a message to the companies that in their next few orders of micromobility devices, they need to begin to include a Lock 2, the ability to Lock 2 something in those orders. We think that gives us enough time to roll out the kind of infrastructure that will be needed, and we think it gives the companies adequate time to adjust to that requirement. So those are some of the big changes, but really I'll just also remind you, when we brought these regulations before you before, what we were hearing about most pointedly from companies was the cap requirement, the fleet cap. You can't put a cap on us. We want to have, as many devices as we can manufacture on the streets of the city. And the council directed those companies to adhere to a cap requirement that was reasonable, but did not put a limit on the number of companies that could operate. And that resulted in the largest scooter company in the scooter operation in the United States, maybe North America, maybe the world. But actually, not one single company actually even got close to the cap that you had established. So, as we think about and reflect on what seemed important at one time, then ended up not being as big of a deal, I think that our role as a city and regulators is to nudge industry and to nudge the market in the direction. We are the leaders. We will set the precedent for many other cities in the United States who look to us, who use all of our data requirements, who pick up our guidelines and plop them right into their cities. So I appreciate the council's willingness to sort of hear us out, think through this complicated issue, and provide the leadership that is not just for this technology, but for all of the things that we know are coming next. Jarvis, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I can give a quick just kind of overview with adding a little bit more detail about some of the things we're doing. My name is Jarvis Murray, and I am the Policy and Enforcement Administrator at the LADOT, and I manage the permitting programs here at LADOT. And I do want to thank everyone for having us here, and I want to thank all the people who made public comment. We do take all of that seriously, and it does inform how we do our work. And I do want to remind everyone that this is a citywide program, and it's a program that we expect to use. We're using the learnings from the technology side as well as the framework that we put together, and we'll be introducing these permitting rules, these rules and guidelines, and making this permit system and adding it to our legacy systems, which includes our taxis and our non-emergency medical transportation groups, as well as our future modes, which will be, particularly autonomous vehicles and urban air mobility. We also developed a very robust compliance program. And as part of that compliance program, we felt that it was important to hold operators accountable. So we have a point system, we develop monthly fines, and there's potential for suspension and revocation. It allows us to determine a good versus a bad actor, and even to determine if a company's permit should be renewed. And so we're going to have 3 phases of compliance moving forward. We're going to have operational compliance, which is primarily related to the devices themselves, fleet management, placement, clutter, insurance, and unsafe vehicles. We're going to have a technical compliance component, which is where we're ensuring that the devices are on the MDS platform, which allows us and gives us the ability to monitor, audit, and manage the right-of-way appropriately. Along with field enforcement, we'll also be doing a lot of digital enforcement. And then finally, we'll have a policy compliance component where we set digital policies. And again, we think that we're going to be one of the first to do this and move our city into the future. But we're setting digital policies, and for example, through geofences, and requiring providers to comply with those policies. And that is also a robust part of our compliance program. So our goal is to improve enforcement. The new rules and guidelines program, it outlines several violations, it assigns the point values to each, and we are going to evaluate again for each company monthly, and we will be managing, those associated penalties. And I also wanted to add a little bit about the equity zones that has been brought up a little bit. We do have improved equity deployment in these rules and guidelines. For example, if you're going to operate in Venice, you will be required to operate 5% of your fleet in an equity zone, in a mobility equity zone. If you're operating in Hollywood or downtown, you'll be required to have 5% of your fleet deployed in a mobility disadvantage zone. And as we work through how to make the MEZ, what we call them MEZ, MDZ zones, we really thought through the process. And we actually heard from this group in particular, and as Ms. Ramos talked about, that in our pilot year, we had a focus on disadvantaged communities, but it was based solely on income, and it was insufficient, and it didn't result in truly equitable deployment. So we think that these rules and guidelines, instead, they're going to designate these 2 different zones, the MEZs, the MDZs, and even though we've received a lot of feedback, I did want to explain how they were somewhat created. So broadly speaking, the MDZ zone, the mobility disadvantage zone, focuses on a lack of access to modal options, such as your proximity to bus and rail stops, how long is the wait there, bike infrastructure, the type of stress you may receive while riding a bike, the shared mobility infrastructure, the travel time, how long is it to get from your home to various job centers, low travel quality, and even crash safety risks. The mobility equity zones, however, represent those same areas with the same issues, but also includes those who are disadvantaged socioeconomically. The MEZ zones were identified, using a hardship index created by the Rockefeller Institute, and those hardship index factors include employment status, income, poverty, education, and overcrowding. And so, in working through these things, we worked with our stakeholders. We worked with the core advisory board. We have an advisory board that helped us talk through the equity principles that we thought through. We worked with tool design to help analyze the citywide data. And this is what we came up with the zones. So many of you have already seen the maps. You've seen the maps of the equity zones. We've heard public comment about those zones. And I think the important thing to note is that the resulting map that everyone is looking at, it identifies areas of the city where the greatest opportunity to account for both transportation and income disparities are. it's about the future modes of tech-enabled transportation as well, and it really offers a guide for investment. It's an overlay of where the city essentially needs to think about its mobility investment. And it is something that we expect to be reviewed and revisited over time. But looking at that, you recognize that operator deployment in the highest ridership areas of the city, we've also tied that to a required percentage deployment in these designated zones. So these zones are where operator fees are going to be reduced and the rider fares are capped. And together, we think this will ensure deployment and increase demand in areas of the city that can benefit most from increased mobility. So in line with looking at equity from both a transportation and income lens, these fare caps, they're not purely a financial break, but they're also an incentive to encourage mode shift in areas that are mostly car dependent. So again, just to reiterate, the maps that were created for the MEZ, MDZ zones, they're essentially guidelines, and they're there to help the city understand where the city needs mobility investment. And this information, again, this isn't just about dockless. And as I wanted to reiterate earlier, this program isn't just about dockless. Dockless is merely the first step. This program is about moving forward with a strong permitting program that takes these goals into view as we move through, as we refranchise or re-permit taxis, as we begin looking at how we're managing our emergency response vehicles, our non-emergency medical response vehicles, as we begin to understand the future of autonomous vehicles and urban air mobility. This is an overlay that we'll be using for all of those modes to help us determine the best way to service the community. And these things will be continually updated. And frankly, using the map as simply a starting point, we're looking forward to working with, council staff and community organizations to ensure that the boundaries and the policies within those zones are comprehensive and effective. And so even to that end, we've even required in our rules and guidelines that the operators formally partner with community-based organizations. And this will help us inform residents of programming and also give them a sense of what's needed in those communities so that they're not just in deploying income, but they're also contributing to the community. Now, we recognize that there's more work to do with these zones and that there's going to be an additional step, but I just wanted to give that quick explanation for how a lot of those things work. So I'll be back to Reynolds if he has anything you want to add.
Great, thank you. So I know we'll have a lot of questions. The map is actually confusing to me. Is there a version of the map that actually has streets on it? Because it's like I look at it and I can sort of have a sense of it, but it would be great to have a more detailed map if that's available.
Appreciate that. I was asking the same, Bob. Thanks. Yeah.
Actually, we haven't published a more detailed map. As we work with providers, we will send them shape files of the area so that we can drill down more tightly, but we can work on drilling that down more tightly and coming back with a more detailed map.
Yeah, I mean, because some of it, I don't want to spend the whole hearing going over the map. I know it's going to be, and people may have questions, but when I look at it, I see in my district, below 101 is a very wealthy area, is a managed zone. I see what I think is pure power, which makes sense. But then I also look at like 4 or 5. I see Beverly Crest and over areas. You're getting advantage zones, which makes a lot of sense to me. So I don't understand all that. I'd like to. Let me ask you: was some of this done to promote geographic equity? Is that one of the factors at all?
No, I think we were trying to identify what I'll call mobility deserts. So you probably all heard about food deserts. They're places where you can't get access to reliable, healthy food, and in long distances. We tried to establish the same measure, but for mobility. So the people who work in service industries, for example, in those areas, there are the residents who live there, and then there are people who may work or need to commute to those areas as well. And so we were looking for parts of the city that do not have good access to transit, that do not have frequent headways and services for buses or rail. And so some of those outcomes that you're pointing at get to that kind of counterintuitive result. And I think what I would say is that I think there's a longer, maybe richer conversation about the map itself to be had where we can adjust those boundaries and maybe make some of those trade-off decisions in concert with your offices and the communities that you serve. But I think that, if we could get general guidance on the idea of, serving those zones as a requirement of having access to the zones that we know the scooter companies want to deploy in Venice, Hollywood, and downtown. That's just clear as day from almost 24 months of data. That's where they want to go. They don't really want to go anywhere else. Then we can kind of report back with a finer grain map with more information on it after getting some input.
Yeah, and I get that, and it makes sense. We do want to promote them to go various places. There is some counterintuitive stuff when it comes to, there's the geographic equity. We want to move them around, and then there's the other equity lens, which is we want folks who can't afford it to have access to the technology. Just like if you're the cleaning person who's going to a house in Beverly Hills or in Beverly Crest or somewhere that's wealthy that wouldn't be in one of these zones necessarily. Yeah, they need to have access to the equipment, but something like that argues for like what they're doing in DC, and I wanted to get your thoughts about that, where they're tying it to the people, and they're tying. Well, I guess some of the operators, as you know, have low cost programs. Could we include a minimum enrollment requirement in the program as one way to tie it to the people? Is that a way to do it that some other areas do it? And why do we or not? Why don't we have something like that in here? And what are your thoughts on that?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I couldn't tell. So I think as we put this program together, we actually already have a low-income program for riders. But what we learned in the pilot program was that no one essentially knew about it. We asked the providers to develop a program, a low-income program, and push it out. And they all did develop a low-income program for individuals. But what it turned out when we did our surveys, the majority of people did not know that this even existed, or how to apply, or how to do any of that extra legwork. So rather than relying on the operators, we felt that as a department and as a city, we're going to have to again have a stick that enforces more of a disbursement throughout the community. And even through our use of trip fees, we're using trip fees to also kind of help manage that. We have a trip fee and an SOZ that's going to be 40 cents, a trip fee and an MEZ that will be free for companies. So again, we don't want them to oversaturate in the highest utilized areas, Hollywood, Venice. That's where they'll pay the most to use their devices. We want to encourage them to go over to the other areas, the base areas, the NDZ, the MEZ zones, and operate there at a much lower cost. So we're trying to find ways to incentivize that. And if their ridership is low based upon our trip fees, they're not giving nearly as much to the city. So our trip fees are really based upon their ability to do their work and to increase or lower their deployment.
Just as a follow-up, and then I know a lot of members have questions, and some people are on tight schedules, so I'll stop asking questions in a second, or I'll wait till the end. But couldn't we have that kind of a stick with the low-cost options as well? Like you mentioned, the problem was that people didn't know about them, and these operators were not incentivized, or they were incentivized, but they didn't have the they weren't doing it. They weren't really pushing it out. So is there something where there could be a stick on that, where you say, okay, well, you don't get to put out more scooters until you have X number of people enrolled, or you don't get to operate unless you have X number of people enrolled, or something to that effect?
I think part of the challenge with that is that would be almost entirely self-reported. There's really not a lot of great ways we have to audit that in the same way that we can audit deployment of the vehicles. The availability of the vehicles is just as critical to getting those equity outcomes as, you know, whether or not they have people enrolled in their equity programs. We can certainly strengthen our auditing of those programs. We can reconsider whether we might want to impose a requirement for enrollment in those programs, but I wouldn't say that I would recommend doing that in absence of the deployment requirement, because that's something that's easy for us to verify and validate. It's something that can't be gamed, and it's something where we just saw such a complete failure during the pilot period. I mean, we have virtually no single company deploying in the San Fernando Valley. Even though in exchange they could have gotten the ability to deploy a lot more vehicles citywide. So in other words, it was worth it to the companies not to serve certain parts of the city, even though in exchange they would have been able to deploy a higher number of vehicles and get access to more trips citywide. So I do think that a geographic deployment requirement has to be part of whatever we consider. We can include or consider adding a requirement of enrollment in the low fare program, but we're pretty limited in our ability to truly verify whether or not that's accurate. So I wouldn't want to do that instead of the deployment requirement that we have in place. And I do think that it's worth it to take a look at the map in closer detail and adjust those boundaries based on collective knowledge of the city and advice from the Community Advisory Board, which is comprised of community-based organizations that work on social justice issues, and in particular in some of the neighborhoods that weren't served. I think we want to sort of work with them maybe to think that through. But I don't know that just having an equity, enrollment requirement by itself would guarantee the kinds of outcomes that we're after.
Okay, I know we're tight for time, so I'm going to go to Mr. Chairman Bonin, and then to Mr. Buscaino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to LADOT for the report. It's sort of like I guess the maps are the new caps. It's the issues that sort of defines our discussions this year, as Ms. Reynolds indicated, that the caps, inventory caps, were a couple years ago. I'll get to the maps in just a second. First of all, let me just again thank LADOT for what I think is a pretty serious evaluation of the pilot program. The findings of this evaluation, I think, are appropriately critical where the program fell short and proposes concrete solutions to those issues. So I think this is evidence that LADOT is doing a good job as a regulator of micromobility. Like all of us, particularly those of us who have the high saturation areas, I still get a lot of complaints, not as many as I used to. Part of that is because of regulations that have been put in place, and part of that is because of the pandemic, I'm sure. But then part of it also is because I think LADOT has been so responsive and has continued to fine-tune the special operation zones where I've had the most issues in CD11. So thank you for that. As has been discussed, one of the things I'm most focused on is the equity provisions of the program, and I really want to make sure they're successful. And those were almost sort of a last-minute addition during our first go-round. It was something that Ms. Martinez and I were really interested in committee, and said, no, we have to have equity provisions, and then we sort of had to build up around that. And I think we're learning as we go, and I think we need to do better. And as Ms. Reynolds pointed out, the carrot itself is not alone enough, and we need to be doing more stick in order to be a responsible regulator and to promote equity. I think that the concept of the mobility equity zones and the mobility disadvantage zones, the MEZ and the MDZ, are a really phenomenal idea, and the policies that LADOT proposes to go with them, I'm totally on board with. I'm just concerned, as you've heard from some of the others, and I appreciate Jarvis sort of anticipating this and talking about it, concerned with the criteria that have been used to select some of those zones, and I do agree they need a lot of adjustment, not just fine tuning. I think they need some broad brush adjustment. Just for instance, in my part of town, identified as, I guess, mobility deserts are the biowetlands, Mountain Gate, and just outside my district on the border, the VA cemetery. Mountain Gate is way atop a mountain where there's really no demand for these that I've ever heard articulated. Biowetlands, we love birds in the biowetlands, but we like them of the flying variety and not the motorized scooter variety. The VA cemetery, if there is a latent demand for the scooters in the VA cemetery, I would be both surprised and impressed. So I think those are an example of some of the adjustments where it doesn't make sense, and we certainly heard from CD15 where there needs to be adjustments in the other ways. So I want to see us do a finer look at what the criteria should be for those two zones, and I'll be asking for a little more work on that, but I will also be totally supporting the department's recommendations to move forward on this. And I just want to underscore the importance of equity. I mean, this has come down to people wanting to do business in Venice and Hollywood and downtown, and I don't think you should be allowed to do business in Venice if you're not doing business in the San Fernando Valley for this type of program. Or if you're not interested in doing business in South LA, we need to have a program that works for all of Los Angeles. And the alternative for me to LADOT's recommendations, to the extent that people are objecting to LADOT using the stick to put more equity in, is not that we go softer. It's going to be in the other direction. If we can't get a program that is equitable, if we can't get a program that is providing service to mobility deserts and to areas that are in need of transportation, then we shouldn't be doing them in sort of the high opportunity areas either. So I'm fully on board with DOT's recommendations, and I want to thank them for it.
Okay, thank you. It's Mr. Buscaino next, followed by Mr. Koretz, followed by Mr. Root.
Thank you to Chairman Blumenfield and Chairman Bonin for agendizing this collectively with the two committees. I want to remind you all, in 2017, I was proud of the fact that my district was first to pilot dockless mobilities with dockless bikes, and of course technology advanced where the scooters came in play, and we've been big supporters of the program ever since. The communities I represent, I'm really proud of the residents who were able to call in earlier to express their thoughts and their support moving forward. And we've all welcomed dockless bikes and scooters in 2017 with open arms. And in less than 3 months, we told the body, we told the entire council and the Department of Transportation that, let us be the guinea pig, per se. Let us show, the successes and challenges of mobilizing dockless mobility in a district. And in less than 3 months, with just one company operating in the district, there were a total of 32,000 rides covering 40,000 miles and 5,000 active riders. However, over time, the number of scooters and dockless bikes in our districts decreased drastically. And when the pilot program began, many operators chose not to come into Council District 15 at all. The data over the past year and a half shows that we are typically in the bottom 3 districts in terms of number of devices deployed, average daily rides, and related measures. And as the report points out, some communities need an incentive for operators to establish a real lasting presence in them. However, the metric used to create these incentive zones that are proposed in this report, the MEZs and the MDZs, is, I feel, not the right way to go. This is an extremely data-driven study, and I applaud LADOT and the consultants for focusing so heavily on data throughout this pilot and its final analysis. And while data can be a helpful measure, it can't be the only measure for all things. when creating the equity zones for the proposed on-demand mobility program, we need to ask ourselves which communities need micro-mobility options that don't already have them or may not be naturally predisposed to attracting them. Or do we ask the people who live in our communities and the electeds who represent them this single question? I look at the proposed MEZ and MDZ map in this report. I know Chairman Blumenfield indicated, and I agree. To be honest, I was confused. The vast majority of my hardest hit communities are not included, as you heard from the callers. A little bit about my district. The average annual wages across my district is 20% lower than the city's average, and that's across all communities. So I appreciate Mr. Bond in indicating equity and moving forward is an important piece with the deployment of mobility options. When you zoom in, some of my communities are 30 to 50% below the city's average. Nearly 30% of households in my district earn less than $25,000 a year. And we're also the most polluted district in the city and have the lowest tree canopy. We're a very racially and ethnically diverse district. And finally, by all measures, many neighborhoods are considered to be transit deserts, as Ms. Lita Reynolds alluded to, and generally lacking adequate transportation infrastructure and access to transportation options. So with that, a couple questions. First, to Ms. Reynolds, I understand that a couple of the companies have approached the department wanting to mobilize and deploy a number of the units in San Fernando Valley and in the harbor area communities. But I understand they got some pushback with concerns of oversaturation. Is that true?
Not from us.
Okay.
Not from us. I mean, we have been begging them to deploy in those areas and have really gotten nothing back in return.
Okay, got it. So there hasn't been a concern of oversaturating economic depressed areas throughout the city, such as...
No, I mean, I guess, Councilmember, the only thing I could say is that initially in some community meetings that we had in some of those areas, companies communicated that they had gotten negative feedback from residents saying, we don't want these in our neighborhoods, we don't need these, etc. But clearly the city, from, at this body's direction, had been putting incentives to deploy there. And so from our perspective, what was needed was not a lack of deployment, but more genuine engagement in community to help folks understand and to work with them on their concerns. And we just didn't see that. So you'll see that also baked into these rules and guidelines that we are asking these companies to engage with community-based organizations in these communities to work with, to actually get the word out, to educate people on safe riding, and to get deployment. Because we saw most everywhere these things got deployed, where people needed to get around, they got used. So not from our side.
Okay, good to know. I'm glad that we have that on the record as well. I do appreciate the Cal Enviro screening that they did a great job, but I feel that as representatives of the district, we know the district well, and just appreciate to have that line of communication between the council offices and with the department and the private companies. Question on, you heard from Max Shorty, how is that Watts, for example, is not including in the MEZ and MDZ map, but many of the wealthy hillside communities in other districts are included?
Jarvis, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so on the MEZ map, Watts should be included, but based upon what we see on the map, the entirety of Watts is likely not included. So again, we recognize that there's some additional work that may need to be done, but the MDZ zones are different. MEZ zones are focused on economically disadvantaged, and the MDZ more transportation disadvantaged. So those areas are scattered throughout the MDZs throughout CD15. However, the Watts region only has a small MEZ zone, as far as I can tell on the map. Yeah,
I mean, and I'm kind of puzzled too. Is our Watts Rising initiative that led to millions of dollars of grant funds from the state on the transformative climate communities, which we're doing all we can to attract and also mobilize green technology. So I'm kind of puzzled why the entire Watts community wasn't included. So we can talk offline and how we get there. How can we ensure that the communities that may not naturally attract private companies coming into them due to density, infrastructure, income levels, or otherwise, how do we ensure that communities that want and need micro-mobility options receive them, and what other options did you consider moving forward?
Well, I think this is the first step, actually, in terms of making that happen. Obviously, as a department, we're working with the providers, and we're going to work with communities, and we're having the providers partner with communities to help us all determine what are the best needs throughout the community. So even as we look through, where the zone should be and that type of information, as I stated before, we recognize that there's an additional step, and there's a reality on the ground that maybe the data doesn't fully see. And so we're actually here to do that work. The program will be here. We expect to make the changes over time throughout the year into the following years. And so we expect to be able to do that and work to improve that for areas that come in and say, hey, can we help get these out here? That's our role to help, incentivize the providers to getting into those areas.
A couple more things. We know how much the program costs now that we've gone through it. We know how much it costs us to run it. We also know how much we want to invest in community outreach and engagement. And so the department has, as part of our costs, so where the fees will go, an engagement, ability to invest in community-based organizations to do exactly the kind of outreach that you're talking about, because we recognize that as a shortcoming of the first year. We relied heavily on companies to do that outreach on their own. And as y'all know, it is just so much more successful when you can partner with an organization that already has built trust in the community and can do that kind of outreach and that kind of work. And so we've asked for both the companies to work with community-based organizations and to use a subset of our fees that we collect for LADOT to do that outreach as well, so that we can have that, because as you pointed out, data is one piece. But as you know from doing all the work in your district, sometimes it's a very small piece of getting to success, and we recognize that and want to invest in those organizations already in the community to do the work that you've described. And so that's why we hard-coded it in to both the requirements for the companies and the fees that we receive.
And Selena, would you be okay with moving forward on consulting with the council districts and members as we move forward in the program on the deployment of micro-mobility options?
Absolutely. I hope that all of the council offices will be as excited and interested to engage on this issue so that we can get those neighborhoods right, we can get the community-based organizations out there, and we can put these things where people need them the most, and they'll do the most good. But that we keep that requirement in place, that if you want access to the places in the city where you're going to get the most rides, then we have to ensure that you are serving parts of the community that you might not go as a purely sort of profit-driven endeavor.
Okay, and then I just want to close that last piece, if I can, Selena, on the concern of oversaturating disadvantaged communities. Is that a concern from the department?
So one of the things that's one of the reasons why we wanted to push on this lock to requirement and use some of the funding that we received to put in, places, bike racks and other things where people can actually lock to those devices. And then if we begin to see oversaturation as an issue, we have a really good track record of places where we had oversaturation in Councilmember O'Farrell's district and Councilmember Bonin's district, to come back at the direction of council and establish these special operations zones, which have very strict rules around how many devices each company can deploy. And we do that based on, some information that we see every day about where these things are going. So we do have tools to address oversaturation directly. I am not, based on what we've seen so far, I am less concerned about oversaturation in underserved communities than I am about just getting service there.
Okay, you know where I'm coming from. You get it. And to Mitch and Mike, if you have oversaturation, come down to, I'll take your units, come down to CD15. Thank you, Mr. Chairs. Plural.
I thought Coretz wanted them all.
I'll take Paul.
We'll get to hear because Paul is next on the list. So, Mr. Kress.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Chair. I'm fine with making the distribution more equitable. In fact, I believe we were oversaturated prior to COVID, and I'd be delighted to send them elsewhere. I would say, from what we hear from our constituents, unlike the testimony that we heard in committee, which I've found since COVID tends to skew very dramatically towards younger folks, those who do not ride scooters tend to detest them in my district. And the primary reason, I think, is safety. And interestingly enough, during this whole conversation, all the testimony, etc., nobody's once mentioned the word safety. And that remains my concern. And since we last discussed this, we have new safety concerns. So first of all, I want to discuss COVID and using scooters. I think this report kind of hides behind the CDC, which has an imperfect record of giving good advice on COVID, even though they would have the ability, starting with their initial advice that people should definitely not wear masks. There clearly is a potential danger in virus transmission, particularly on the handlebars. Also, those who are unmasked while riding can provide a certain amount of danger of spread. So I know the transportation companies were supposed to submit plans. Did they submit plans? What are their plans? And if their plan was just to remove the scooters, which they largely did, what's their plan now that they're beginning to redeploy? So that's my first question. What are our plans to keep the scooters from being a source of transmission of COVID? How often are they going to clean handlebars, et cetera, et cetera? What are all their plans?
Thank you, Councilmember. This is Jarvis Murray again. And we do have sanitation protocols for the providers, which we issued shortly after COVID had begun. So they are required to clean their devices upon deployment daily and to sanitize, as well as to provide those who work with the devices with PPE to help take care of and manage them. So that is actually one of the compliance points that we have. We recognize that it's a big haul. There are numerous devices. But we do require them to do that, and should we find that they are failing in that respect, that is something that we could, under the new program, with the new rules and guidelines, penalize them for.
Do we have any sense of whether they've actually been following them? And frankly, since there hasn't been much action during this period, whether we have a process to enforce their protocols once a much greater number come back?
We do have a sense that they have been following them because immediately after we put out the requirements, many call to talk through, different things, how they're warehousing, where they can move them. Can we do this? Can we do that? And even beyond that, one of our providers, Wheels, I believe, has actually developed technology for their handlebars. It's a self-cleaning technology that's based upon kind of light hitting the handlebars that will actually allow it to self-clean using a special nanotechnology. So they've actually gone out and done that development, and I do believe that the other providers have done what they can to ensure that the devices are clean and sanitized.
Okay, I will assume that that's correct for now. Also, we're trying to slowly reopen by doing more things outdoors. So we have outdoor dining on many streets that are already, on many sidewalks that are already a bit narrow. We'll probably have outdoor hairstyling and other similar uses. So with a certain amount of clutter already on our narrow sidewalks, and the fact that despite our attempts to keep people off sidewalks, we know there will be many riders that use the sidewalk. How are we going to deal with that? How is that going to play out in terms of protocols, in terms of being close enough to spread COVID, in terms of knocking into chairs and tables, etc.?
I think one of the things that we could potentially do is as these areas are being developed, as these special zones for dining outside are being developed, we as a department can start pushing that information to the providers for them to push to their customers, and that will perhaps help stymie some of that tide of customers. We won't be able to cover every single thing. I mean, we can't cover exactly what all the riders can do. All we can really do is try to prevent it. And I do think if we have a map and information where the new zones are beginning to pop up, we can definitely push that to providers to push to their customers to ensure that they're not riding along the sidewalk in those areas.
Okay. Also, I always had questions about the number of collisions that we had in our reports. We listed 407 collisions, and just in anecdotal conversations I had with emergency room docs at Cedars, they claimed at one point that they were averaging at least one scooter injury in the ER per day. So one doc during their own shift would practically cover the whole 407. Certainly Cedars ER alone, without a doubt, would cover 407. Not looking at other ERs, not looking at injuries that might only require a trip to urgent care or their own doctor. Literally, it more likely was in the thousands. Is there a point that we care? If we knew that we had 2,000 injuries or 5,000 injuries, is there a point we would say that's just unacceptable? We really don't want these scooters out there with so many injuries. We know that there are attorneys that have scooter-only practices that only represent the people that have been injured in scooter accidents. That also implies that 400 is a very unlikely low number. And also, have we gotten any breakdown on that data? So do we know how many of those injuries are the person that's riding the scooter themselves being injured, which I think is probably the majority? How many are other pedestrians that they run into? How many are vehicles that they interact with? Do we have any sense of data and detail on that?
The data that we receive primarily comes from the LAPD and the the fire department. So, we can't speak to how all of that is gathered, but that is the data that we get mostly from what they bring to us. And we do know that it declined in the last few months for obvious reasons. We did check with the fire department prior to this hearing, and since March, there have been 40 incidents that the fire department has had to respond to. We were not able to get LAPD information before the hearing today, though, so I unfortunately don't have that information. But in terms of the detail of the data, I'm not sure that we are able to get that without stepping into kind of HIPAA concerns related to the type of injuries that have been received. But we can, and we do try to report what we receive from LAPD and the fire department.
And obviously, any data we've gotten after March, I would think, is largely irrelevant, since certainly just based on my own vision of a neighborhood that was usually buried in these things and then suddenly had hardly any of them, we know that scooter usage has dropped pretty dramatically, and I think all of these companies have dropped their usage pretty substantially. I'm starting to see a few birds around the neighborhood now, but for the most part, I've seen a huge reduction. Also, there's a lot of concern, and always has been, about sidewalk clutter. So what are we doing about, I heard it alluded to, about trying to create parking areas, a requirement to attach to something so it's not just lying across the sidewalk where people trip over them, etc.
So we did actually, that's one of the recommendations in our rules and guidelines, that we have a Lock 2 requirement for all the scooters, and we expected to have that implemented by March of next year, so approximately 8 months from now. We do recognize that as a concern, and it was something that we were looking, that we would hope clear the clutter from the sidewalk. You know, we know that there's been some pushback related to it, but frankly, we thought it was a good idea, and you know, we felt that it addresses oversaturation, and right-of-way management, and you know, it helped for those things such as tip scooters. If we know that it's locked to a stationary object, it's less chance of it being tipped over in the right-of-way, or again, blocking sidewalks and blocking sidewalks for our disabled wheelchairs, or using wheelchairs through the city. So it is something that we do, and we're still continuing to recommend. We know that in San Francisco, they implemented a Lock 2 requirement. They had it in a pilot phase, and they found a reduction in their through-on-one complaints in San Francisco from 1,000 per month to under 150, and that's just, you know, during their pilot for Lock 2. So that is the one thing that we were looking at, and we also learned that operators have reported reduction in lost vehicles based on this Lock 2 requirement. So, you know, we thought it would be a good idea to add this to the program, and that's why so it is a big concern for us, and we actually hope that it stays.
That part is very exciting, and I'm glad we're looking at addressing it. I hope we can. I think that would be a real positive change in dealing with scooters. And one last question that isn't safety related. Are we expending a lot of money on this? And obviously during the COVID period, it's probably less practical to expect to fully recover all our costs in terms of dealing with scooters and other similar vehicles. But post-COVID, do we have a plan that will allow us to recover all of our costs? Because I really don't see a need to be subsidizing this industry.
Well, so our fees, the trip fees that we created, are based on a cost recovery model. We did take into account that there's a slowdown right now in service, and so we did the modeling. You know, we acted as if some companies didn't make it, and that the ridership had decreased. So we did look at that. We do recognize that the trip fees, you know, assuming COVID gets worse, you know, it may hurt us, at least for this year. And if that's the case, then we would adjust our fees accordingly the next year. But as a cost recovery department, we did do the math, and we think that we should be close, you know, or if not meeting our goals in terms of how the cost recovery works. And if things pick up to be even better than we think they are, we would actually exceed cost recovery, and then we would still adjust our fees again the following year to match, so that we're not profiting as a department, but actually being underreported.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thank you, Mr. Koretz. Next, we have Mr. Rue, followed by Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Department of Transportation for their tireless work developing this program, and for continuously adapting to the evolving transportation innovations in our city, especially to this relatively new and dynamic dockless scooters. And, you know, after a year and a half of this pilot program, we've learned a lot about the growth of this technology, and it's positioned us for us to be able to think ahead. And I know there will be additional growing pains with this new form of mobility, and there is no doubt that the variables will continue to shift and change, but I remain a big supporter of this technology. I've been an early supporter, and it's because it's carbon-free, it's accessible, It's a key piece of the puzzle in solving our city's first and last mile problems with transit. And with these new drafted rules and guidelines, we'll be able to get closer to a connected city and reducing the barriers that limit how Angelenos live, work, and play. But I do have a couple of questions and concerns about the report in front of us. And the first one is, and we started talking about it already, which is the Lock 2 solution that is, I believe, intended to solve parking issues, but I do have some real concerns about the requirements. We've seen in other municipalities that have had huge amounts of trouble with vehicles being locked to street furniture, especially in the public right-of-way and ADA accessibility locations. And I don't see a plan to roll out sufficient number of bike stalls to accommodate all of these vehicles. So feels like we're telling operators to spend millions of dollars outfitting their vehicles with this unproven method that could actually cause more harm than good. And I think the real concern here is to make sure that these vehicles are upright and they don't block the right-of-way. And the last time this matter was before us, I asked the department to look into requiring any kind of technology as a potential solution to vehicle parking issues. And from my discussions with Lyft, Spin, Bird, and some of the other companies, I found out that a real solution actually exists. And it's basically that when a scooter is tipped over, and which they could measure by knowing that there's an absolute angle of like 10 degrees off, or laying down on the right-of-way, they have a technology that alerts the company of the fact that the vehicle is down. And I believe Bird already has a program up and running in Santa Monica where it alerts nearby app users of a down scooter and provides a ride credit to anyone who corrects this issue and reparks the property. So I think before we commit to a costly and potentially ineffective solution, I want to first exhaust all other options first. So I want to ask the department, whoever wants to answer, was the department already aware of this technology? And if so, how come they didn't include this in the report?
Thank you for that question. The department was aware that one of the providers had this technology. Was not aware that the others, the two other companies you mentioned had technology. It's something that was considered, but in a sense, for us, whether you do that or the Lot 2 requirement, we both think that there may be still a cost attached to it. So it's, for us, there could be a cost attached to adding that requirement. But again, it's a technological lift that we don't know the exact cost of what it would be. The other part of that is, assuming that they do have that, our question was, well, then what happens? We know maybe it notifies them that the device is tipped over, but what is their plan beyond that? Do they go out and fix it? Do they have roving vans? You mentioned having their customers do it, which sounds like an interesting and actually an innovative solution. But is that something that we're going to require of everyone, to have your customers help manage your fleets? Potentially, but we thought it would be much simpler for us to have something that doesn't rely on the goodwill of others, and also focuses on something that's more visible that we can see. You have your device locked to something, locked to infrastructure, locked to a stationary object. So that was a challenge that we had, but that's where kind of where we landed on that issue.
So, Mr. Chair, I do have a recommendation. Should I wait till the very end for all the recommendations, or do you want me to insert a recommendation now? Because I do have two more questions as well.
You might as well put it out there, and we'll talk about it at the end, but just so that other members can comment on it too.
So the recommendation on this is actually, I would recommend a two-part here. One, that we remove the Lock 2 requirement from the DOT proposed rules and guidelines. And secondarily, I want to recommend that we add a requirement for dockless operators to implement programs or different technologies similar to Bird's technology in Santa Monica, where whether it's gyroscopic technology or any other technology is used to identify and notify dockless vehicle operators of a vehicle being parked improperly or laying on the right of public. and whether they go out and do it themselves or provide credits to app users or any other innovative way to correct this issue and repark it properly. So that's a recommendation I like to propose. And a second question I have is, the last time this matter was before us, I asked the department to report back on operators requiring users to rescan their valid driver's license on a periodic basis to try to cut down on minors riding these vehicles. I know it's kind of addressed in the report, but I'm not really satisfied. And I think the report said that there are liability concerns and that would not materially prevent a minor from using an adult's account to ride. Can the department explain why requiring operators to submit an affidavit or an aggregated information on the number of times an app user uploads a driver's license presents a liability concern? And what type of data or experience the department is using to determine would not be materially beneficial?
So as we look at that type of an issue, the concern that we have on the liability side is that in order to truly enforce that, we'd have to look at whether you're actually uploading the driver's licenses themselves. We as a department have done our best to stay away from personally identifiable information. And so we don't want to track the information. We don't necessarily need to know who's riding. We just want to make sure how you're distributing the vehicles throughout the city. And so if we were to go to a company and say, did you upload it? The only way we could check is just to rely on their self-reporting. That they have to just self-report, and we'd have to trust that it's being done. Otherwise, if we were to attempt to check, we'd actually have to review the driver's license information to ensure that it was valid or, valid and unexpired or something of that nature. And that's not something I think would be good for us to do. And I think that does expose us to a great deal of liability.
Yeah, well, and I think in this case, I'm not actually asking the city to confirm that information, but as we're relying on these various operators to make sure that this happens, right now I believe it's just only happening once. And it's easier for a minor to somehow get an adult's maybe information, credit card or information once, but if we have them having to quarterly rescan it to update it, then whether it alerts their parents or whether it would create some sort of mechanism for it'll be a deterrence basically, right? So, so I would like to add a recommendation, Mr. Chair, that we have a requirement, and of course that information doesn't have to be moved to us. It would be literally the operators just having a quarterly update, but requiring dockless vehicle operators to implement a quarterly rescanning of driver's licenses or any other form of identification used to verify the app and vehicle is being used legally by a person of 18 years of age or older. And my third question is, I know we do have problems, as Councilmember Koretz talked about, with people riding on sidewalks. And this is due to the fact that we have ways to go in connecting our bike lane network and building out an infrastructure that's in need with our of a modern city. And I do support expanding our bike lane network, and I'm working on doing that. But in the very least, we need to tell people where to find bike lanes when they're on a scooter. I believe Lyft makes available maps of existing bike lanes for its riders, and I see no reason why every other company shouldn't be doing the same. So, assuming that the Department of Transportation has an updated list of bike lanes digitally available, is this information that could be sent to operators to add as a map overlay with all of their apps?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that we have that information, that is something that we could push to the providers, assuming they don't have it already. But to the extent that we have it, and we have it in digital form, it is something that we could push to providers.
Great. Then my third recommendation, Mr. Chair, would be to add a requirement for dockless vehicle operators to offer a map overlay of available bicycle lanes in the area of a rider's starting point. And if and when DOT determines whether such information is held digitally or in some sort of transferable format.
Great. I mean, comfortable with that. We may have to have discussion or have a vote on it, but thank you for telegraphing it.
don't think we can hear you.
Are you done, Mr. Rook?
Yes, that's all my questions and recommendations.
Harold's next. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, DOT, for your report and all of your work and research and sharing your experiences with the pilot program over the course of a year. I tried to boil down my questions after listening to the conversation. My questions center around the Lock 2 technology as well. By and large, this Lock 2 technology is technology that travels with the vehicle for the most part, I would think, because the user isn't going to want to walk a block or two or more to then lock their vehicle to some existing and fixed in place piece of infrastructure. That sort of belies the reason people use dockless scooters and bikes for the most part. Is that accurate?
Yes, and in terms of how each device may manage their Lock 2s, that part we don't know. Each device is slightly different. Each company manages it differently. But we would expect it to be something that is on the device itself.
Right. And for the most part,
the first step is just to require that the fleet can lock to something. To just say to the industry, this is an upgrade we want you to make to your fleet. To Councilman Rue's questions, these devices can be upright and still blocking sidewalks and still cluttering the pedestrian right-of-way. Ultimately, we want the fleet to be able to lock to something, and then we want to have the infrastructure there that's readily available for people to lock to it. So we're not putting that requirement in yet, that the scooters have to be locked to something. We're just trying to nudge the market in the direction that we ultimately want to land.
I get it. It seems to me that the burden for making sure that the vehicle is stored safely after use, the responsibility and burden should be on the user and not dependent upon someone who steps in and does something nice. So in other words, if it's the Lock 2, the clock could just keep ticking until the device itself, through technology, verifies that it is secure out of the public right-of-way and locked to something. So it would seem that that responsibility could fall to the user itself. And that's the direction I think that we would need to head, because like so many others, just in literally walking my dog, I'll take discarded scooters out of Eagle Rock Boulevard and place them on the curb or place them out of the way of people walking on the sidewalk. So the clutter is a real issue, and it is, the discarded piece is a safety concern for sure. So does that make sense? Put the burden on the Lock 2 piece to the user. That's what I would recommend. And it seems to me that that would be a technological possibility. Do you all think differently, or does that make sense?
So that I can clarify what you're saying is the device should be able to lock to something, right? So the scooter itself should be able to lock to something, but then ultimately the requirement should be that the device be secured and locked before the ride can end.
Correct.
Okay. We can certainly work on, I think that would be phase 2 after we get everybody on board, that they're nodding their head and saying, yes, we'll make sure that our scooters have basic technology that bikes have had for centuries, that they can lock to something. Then we can move into what you're asking for, which I think is definitely the right step, which is looking at how do you ensure that it is a requirement of the user. And I think the way to do that is that you make it a requirement of the program and something Jarvis's team enforces, right? That they have discovering a certain percentage of scooters that are not locked to something, that can begin to be something that can be calculated as a mark against companies that they then have to pay a fee for, and then they will right away make sure that they pass that along to the users so that they're required to lock to something. I think that's how that chain of events would go. Am I understanding what you're laying out?
Yes, because the incentive for the user is that the clock stops ticking on their fees that they're accruing. And if what triggers that is it's locked, secure, and out of the public right-of-way, then everyone's in business. Kind of like when you rent a car, you don't want it to return it with dents or out of gas because you pay a premium on refueling, and then you get hit with that later. So it's an incentive, and it just kind of keeps everyone on the straight and narrow, if you will.
Gotcha.
And so the other is, I'm going to just kind of run through these. Oh, yes, please do meet with staff in terms of the definitions of the transit disadvantage zones, so we can get some clarification on that, because Hollywood is a big community, but is also crisscrossed with dash lines, metro buses, and a metro red line subway. So there are lots of transit opportunities, but yet it's a disadvantaged zone. Now, the difference between Hollywood Boulevard is vastly different than Santa Monica Boulevard. So anyway, I'd like to sort of dive deeper into that definition. So I appreciate meeting with the offices on that. And just as per some of the callers, can you all explain, and I'm not, I have no opinion on this one way or another, but why not extend the period a little longer, as most of the callers suggested, before we go into this next phase? Can you all underscore why you don't think that's a good idea?
I think part of the thinking was, the council had extended the initial permit or pilot period by 6 months. And we felt as a department that it was, burden was on us to make sure we brought you back a robust evaluation of that pilot and allowed you to take action based upon it. I think that from my perspective, there's not a lot that we're still piloting. We understand how these things work. We've dived deep into the data. We've talked to community organizations. We've talked to the providers. We've come up with what we think is a beginning of a steady state program. And that's really what we're presenting you with. I don't know that from a policy perspective, I have a sense that there's some policy objective that gets met by extending the program. But I'm not the policy-making body, so I'll leave that up to y'all. But that's why we're presenting it. We know what we have a good idea about. We know what we know as regulators, and we've done all of our due diligence. And so we wanted to bring this forward.
I appreciate that. And having said that, we're not ending the efforts at working with some of the community groups, some of the companies on further refining whatever it is we do ultimately. That will continue as we move into this next phase, right?
Yes, and we've tried very much as a regulatory agency to strike that posture from the beginning. You've heard me say every time I come before you that we want these things to succeed because they do have a carbon offset, value. They do provide real choices for people to get around. And so we have taken the posture that we would rather work with a company than punish a company. And we really didn't dole out a lot of heavy-handed punishments as a regulator. We have tried to strike that tension between partner and regulator, and we will absolutely continue to do that. We're not going to, take off the mask now that we have the full program in place and turn into a completely different department and completely different people. That's not our intent. We want these companies to succeed.
And March 1st is less than 5 months away now. So in relation to the infrastructure requirements, how do you feel that we'll be able to meet that?
So we have both the funding in place. You mean the parking infrastructure?
Yes.
The bike racks. So we have both luckily, we have both of those things under our purview at DOT. So we do have a work plan for the bike parking team and funding for them to deploy bike parking throughout the city, particularly based on data in places where we see there's heavy use and high clusters of these devices. And so I think we are in good shape to make a lot of progress, but we could certainly, come back at some point, after that March deadline ticks off, and have a report back with the committees on where we are in the infrastructure and whether or not it's time to now require users to actually park the vehicles.
And Salita, it's not just bikes. Is it all vehicles, scooters, everything, infrastructure? So you're talking about the Lock 2 infrastructure and then the actual docking facilities that the city may or may not install based on the data that you have. And do we have a sense of the locations, the number of locations across the city, with your mapping of what that will require, and we can reach that within 5 months?
We do have a sense of the locations and a sense of the numbers of racks that are needed. As you know firsthand, there are actually a relatively manageable number of places where we see really high numbers of deployments. And so in some ways, and some of those places already have some infrastructure in place. We're not starting from nothing. But that's a report back we'd be happy to bring back before you as we get closer. But we do have a work plan laid out. We know where the locations are. We know how many numbers of racks we want. We have sort of goals. And we've got our, we work closely with the Conservation Corps, actually, to install those bike racks. So it's a great partnership and community-based program as well.
Okay, great. And then there is a fiscal impact. I'm unclear, and maybe it's too soon to have complete clarity on the cost to the city based on the requirements that we're going to impose on these companies. When will we have a sense of what this entire program will cost the city of Los Angeles? Or is it be cost neutral?
It is meant to be cost neutral. So we do know what it cost us to run this program for the last 18 months in terms of person hours and infrastructure that we put in place. So the report points out that we have installed infrastructure based on this program, and the fees collected from round one. We put in protected bike lanes or mobility lanes in places where we had high numbers of riders and high numbers of injuries, to Councilmember Peretz's questions. We went in and put in some infrastructure to try and address those things directly. So we know how much it costs, and we've tried to put forward the trip fees to cover those costs. And then as Jarvis pointed out, we want to give these companies some certainty. So we don't want to have we want to go through the first year and then come back and present our reporting about whether or not we were able to get the fees to match what we know the program costs. But those program costs do include infrastructure, outreach, working with community-based organizations, and our staff time.
And lastly, Mr. Chair, just the equity zone piece, coupled with just other neighborhoods that really want these, like San Pedro, that where the rollout was so robust and the use seemed to be very, very robust as well. The equity piece I believe in so firmly as well, the whole equity zone. So I do think that we need a mechanism that, contingent upon the companies being able to expand in high demand use areas, that we land on a formula where they will also then go into areas where perhaps there's little or no demand simply because people don't know or expect this amenity in their neighborhoods. So I think that we need to put that burden on the companies as well. There needs to be a cost benefit for everyone involved, and the cost is to the companies, but the benefit is they get to expand in the neighborhoods where there are high usage, but they're required to also expand it to communities that have been traditionally overlooked and ignored. And then I would think that in neighborhoods like San Pedro, where the use was so heavy at first, I'd like to know from the companies, and this is something maybe we can report back on, why did they pull out? Is it because they received complaints due to sidewalk clutter and abandoned scooters? It would seem that if there's high usage anywhere in the city, that's just good business. So I would love to know why we have a successful high-use rollout in a neighborhood that isn't Venice or Hollywood or downtown, and why the scaling back after an initial heavy use. I don't really quite have the answer to that based on this this whole conversation, but that should be answered.
Thank you, Mr. O'Farrell. And toward that equity point, one of my recommendations I was going to add in is directing DOT to report back on the feasibility of implementing a minimum requirement of rides at a reduced fares for low-income riders with the removal of the rate cap in the mobility disadvantaged zones. So to try to tie those two together to encourage that, because I agree wholeheartedly we want to use that equity lens to try to get folks who might otherwise not use it or feel like it's not accessible to have access to it.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
So it seems like we're still. I can see where we're landing. I've been doing a little back and forth with my co-chair here as well. And the one area where I don't know that we have a consensus is the Lock 2 issue. And I wanted to ask a few questions about that, because I agree that it's good to move forward on the technology side so that they have to have that ability. And if we get the infrastructure, particularly in the high-use sides with the bike racks, it makes a lot of sense. But what about the other areas that don't have the infrastructure, that are less, high use? Does that mean people are going to be locking them to, to parking signs or parking meters, which is not legal, or are they going to be locking them to fences, or how is that going to work? And is it also going to compete with when you're in an area that only has a few bike racks, and then we're locking all the scooters and all the other devices to it? We've now done a disservice to our folks who have private bikes or private scooters, because they have to lock them, otherwise they'll get stolen. So how does that all work, and how do we balance those two issues?
Well, the Lock 2 requirement was meant to be a phased-in program. So we recognized that what we wanted to do was to make the requirement so that the devices had the ability to do it. And then we would work based upon the infrastructure that's created to begin the requirement for the actual users. So we do have a plan for developing infrastructure. I know we're working on one this winter and hoping to begin implementation shortly after that. But we did not expect, for instance, come March, that we would have a Lock 2 requirement where your riders have to lock to no matter where they are in the city. We expected to have a requirement that you'd only have to lock to in areas that have the appropriate infrastructure for you to begin locking to. So it was always going to be a phased requirement. It was never going to be an all at once. It was going to be over time as we develop the infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think we had identified that kind of tiered approach where there are certain zones where we've started out by putting decals on the sidewalks, particularly in places that have a high number of people walking, a high concentration of transit stops, a lot of other things going on in the right-of-way. But then there are other parts of the city where that isn't the case, and there's also perhaps not as many scooter rides occurring and not as many scooters creating that clutter concern. It's heightened in certain parts of the city. And so we were, thinking that we would take that same sort of zoned approach as Jarvis just articulated.
Okay, so by approving what we have in front of us, we're obviously not putting in place the Lock 2 requirement. We're getting the technology there, and would this council have another bite at the apple when it comes to when that happens? Drew, you wanted to jump in on this? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Based on what Salita said, what if we modify it to say, since you're not requiring every company to have the Lock 2 mechanism, why don't we leave it a little bit more open-ended? Because I think the goal here is to make sure that they're not in the right-of-way and they're standing upright and they're not tipped over where it could be a trip hazard. So why don't we let the companies innovate before they put in the locking mechanism to if they have a different way of making sure that it's parked in the right places and stood upright, isn't that the goal? So if that's the goal, if we could have, as we're rolling it in, having them prove to us that they could get that done. So it could be a lock mechanism, or it could be a gyroscope technology, or whatever it is to make sure that happens.
I'm not certain that the gyroscope technology removes the issue of clutter. on the sidewalks. But we're open to hearing from council and whatever direction you guys like to give us about it. But I'm convinced that the Lock 2 requirement will help to remove the clutter, and the gyroscope technology, while keeping scooters upright, may or may not be as strong in removing clutter from the middle of the sidewalk.
I think maybe
Chair Blumenfeld, to your question, I think maybe what I was discussing with Councilmember O'Farrell is that the Lock 2 requirement on the scooter itself needs to be in place in the fleet by March. And at that point, we could return to council with a report out on the status of the infrastructure, the ability, whether or not we think we have adequate infrastructure. What, to Councilmember O'Farrell's description of, could we start to require a percentage of the fleet to be locked to something? And third, what parts of the city are most in need, and how could we sort of, there are some parts of the city where it might not make sense to put a bike rack in the middle of, Van Owen in the West Valley. But it's also probably okay if there's one scooter on that sidewalk that's not really blocking people's right-of-way, because perhaps that sidewalk in that area is not as crowded, and it doesn't present the same kind of issue that it would in the middle of downtown Los Angeles or Koreatown or Hollywood. So we could bring that back to you in March for discussion and final resolution on whether or not on what requirements we would put in place to supplement the Lock 2 device.
I think that makes sense, as long as we have a clear understanding, or maybe we can add that into the amendments here or to the recommendations. While we're requiring the technology, we are not moving forward on the requirement until this council gives that authorization. Would that work for you, Mr. Ruhr?
Sure. Since we're going to make the final decision in March, I would like to leave it more open-ended, but I'll be agreeable to that so we have more time to work on this issue.
Well, I'm saying what we can do to make it clear that it's open-ended is put language into the recommendations that say, while we're requiring the Lock 2 technology, we are, it cannot be implemented, or it cannot be required until the council acts.
Sure. And because I just want to point out that I think in other cities, without the proper infrastructure, or if the proper infrastructure is already filled with bikes, or with dockless bikes already locked, they could lock it to other structures and possibly even block or impede walkways and disability ramps and things like that, which will cause a different type of problem. The scooter will be upright, but it will actually block or impede various walkways. So I'm just afraid that the Lock 2 mechanisms might create an unintended consequence, which is why I would like an open-ended, like you suggested, Mr. Chair, where we could go till March to figure out if the various companies could come up with a different alternative method that is suitable for our folks at DOT.
So you say, I'm okay. To delay the Lock 2 requirement, require DOT to report back before the implementation while investigating the tip-over technology as well.
Yes, that'll be workable.
Okay. I think I'm figuring out how to land this plane. Mr. Kress.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one issue in passing that we discussed about half an hour ago that I wanted to follow up on, which is the idea of scooters having some sort of an app with a list of all of our bike lanes. I presume from the conversation we don't have that, and even irrespective of scooters, ideally we'd have an app and a place on the DOT website that had a map of all of our bike lanes and bike paths. So if we don't have that, it might be something for us to develop anyway, and then figure out how to add that to the scooters. But I think that's a great idea, and it would be of value to a lot of the less skillful bike riders like myself, where I rarely would get out on a street unless it had a bike path or a bike lane to provide additional safety.
Ms. Reynolds, do you know, do we have that? You can answer for me.
We do have that, and we share it with Google. So it's yes.
It's out there. It's online.
Yes. Yes.
Is there an app that allows a member of the public to access that?
Yeah.
Besides Google Maps?
It's Google Maps on.
How do we let people know about it?
So it's publicly available on Google Maps. You can just click it. Is that right?
And we also have the shape files available. We can share. Those are on the Open Data Portal, so anybody can build an app that wants to build an app that does that, and any of the scooter companies can access that information and share it with their riders.
So they could do that now, and we certainly should encourage them to do that in the next few months.
Indeed.
Absolutely. All right, Mr. O'Farrell, and then I'm going to try to land the plane.
Yeah, really quick, Mr. Chair. I owe an apology to DOT. I said we have less than 5 months. We have just less than 6 months. So I took a month away to get ready for March 1st. So my apologies. I'm in such a hurry to get 2020 over with. I just jumped the gun. So my apologies.
All right. Looks like, judging by Salita's reaction, your apology has been accepted. I do think in terms of timing, with all the ordinances that need to be drafted and everything else, to be safe, we really need to extend the pilot for a couple of months to December 31st, just 3 months, and that'll give us a chance to get all of this done. But I think we're ready to land this plane. So I'm going to make a few recommendations and see what you all think of this. I think it captures what everybody has been saying, and the recommendations would be as follows. To approve as amended. First, number 1, to adopt the updated rules and guidelines for a dockless permitting program and authorize the general manager to make technical changes as needed. Number 2, to request the city attorney to prepare an ordinance amending the LA Municipal Code 7129 and any other necessary ordinances to create an annual permit program, including drafting a penalty schedule, drafting a revised fee schedule to include trip fees, and drafting an appeal process. This is what I think is going to take some time, which is why we need a little bit of time. Number 3, direct LADOT to report back in 6 months on the status of the program. 4, to direct LADOT to report back in 45 days with revised boundaries for mobility equity zones and mobility disadvantage zones, with an emphasis on coherent neighborhood boundaries, socioeconomic barriers to mobility, need for access to high-quality transit, and local community-based organization capacity and support. And obviously to work with the different council offices on that redraft.
Thank you. Yeah, on that, Mr. Chair, I'm assuming it's implied that with the consultation of the council offices.
It's implied, but I'll add it into the language. So community-based and with consultation of the local council offices. Number 5, direct DOT to report back on the feasibility of implementing a minimum requirements of rides at reduced fares for low-income riders with a removal of the rate cap in mobility disadvantaged zones. That's what Mr. O'Farrell and I were talking about in terms of trying to create an incentive for that. Number 6 would be to authorize an extension of the current pilot program until December 31st, 2020, so a 3-month extension. And then to direct the DOT to amend rules and guidelines to delay in the Lock 2 requirement and require LADOT to report back before the implementation while investigating the tip-over detection technology. And then also to add a requirement for dockless vehicle operators to implement the quarterly rescanning of driver's licenses or other forms of identification used to verify the app and vehicles being used legally by a person 18 years or of older. Hopefully I captured that correctly through. And then lastly, to require operators to provide information about nearby bicycle facilities in the app for navigation purposes, if and when DOT determines whether such information is held digitally in the transferable format. We kind of talked about that just a minute ago. So those are the way I think.
I will make the same motion for T committee.
Yeah, no, this is a joint motion.
Yep.
I'm assuming.
Mr. Chair, the one correction, I think you said bicycle facilities. It's actually bicycle lanes in the very last.
Require operators to provide information about nearby bicycle lanes. Thank you. Okay. Is that, Mr. Bonin, does that capture what your committee is? I know we've been...
Absolutely, and I want to thank you for landing this plane because I was ready to parachute out about an hour and a half ago.
Yes. It's been a very long day for all of us. We've been nonstop. We have Zoom fatigue 10 times over because of a long council meeting and this long meeting. The meeting is almost over. We have one more thing to do after this that will be very quick for the Public Works Committee. But with that recommendation, with those recommendations, and I'll provide them in a written form to the clerk, I think we're ready to vote. So if you could call the roll, and we will we'll vote on the item with the recommendations as amended.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. For the Public Works and Gang Reduction Committee votes, Blumenfield.
And you're on mute, Ms. Kidd.
Thank you. For the Public Works and Gang Reduction Committee votes, Blumenfield.
Blumenfield, aye.
Rue.
Aye.
Buscaino.
Buscaino, aye.
O'Farrell.
Aye.
Lee.
Mr. Lee had to leave for a meeting, so he is absent.
Thank you. And for the Transportation Committee member votes, Bonin.
Aye.
Buscaino.
Aye.
Correct.
Well, while I think we're improving in our safety, I still don't consider them safe enough, so I'll be a no.
Okay, so that it passes in the Public Works and it passes 2-1 in Transportation. Is there any other business before that is before the joint committees? We have one item before the Public Works. I don't believe so. So, Transportation Committee, thank you very much for joining us in this hearing. You guys are welcome to stay, but you're also welcome. And thank you. No problem. See you later. And real briefly for the Public Works Committee, I needed to be more clear on item 7, I believe, which is that we are adopting the recommendations in the Bureau of Engineering's June 22nd, 2020 revised report. I believe that was the recommendation that didn't get picked up in the last one, and I believe we may need to vote on that since it was not mentioned. So let's do a quick vote on item 7 as amended with that amendment.
Thank you. Calling the roll for item number 7 to adopt the report dated June 22nd, 2020. Blumenfield.
Blumenfield, aye.
Rue. I'll come back. Oh, Rue.
Aye. Sorry.
No problem. Buscaino.
Buscaino, aye.
O'Farrell.
Aye.
Lee is absent. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well then, sir, thank you very much. That item passes unanimously. Is there any other items before us?
Item number 3, Mr. Chair.
Didn't we do item 3? Oh no, yeah, item 3. Sorry. All right. Yes, if you could read item 3 into the record, please.
Item number 3 is a Board of Public Works report relative to a transfer of funds from the Public Works Trust Fund loan for COVID-19 emergency response. This item is also referred to the Budget and Finance Committee.
Okay. Do we have any report on this item?
Hi, good afternoon, council members. This is Fernando Campos with the Board of Public Works. Pleased to report to you today on the Public Works Trust Fund loan being requested by the Mayor's Office for $75 million to assist in the ongoing necessity of emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic expenses. As you all are aware, the City of Los Angeles declared an emergency for the coronavirus pandemic back on March 4th. Since March to April, the city transferred about $20 million from its emergency reserve funds to the city's general city purposes fund, and also borrowed an additional $125 million from the Building and Safety Permit Enterprise Trust Fund for COVID-related expenses. The Board of Public Works recently received a request from the Mayor's office requesting a loan of $75 million for the ongoing need to procure additional supplies and materials and services for the COVID response. The good news for us is that there is currently about $142 million in the Public Works Trust Fund. We are happy to assist the mayor and happy to assist the city, happy to assist the council on transferring these funds over to the city's general city purpose fund to move forward with the COVID response. Very quickly, in regards to our balance to loan ratio for the Board of Public Works, currently we have about $39 million in outstanding loans that have been already approved. That puts us around 27% balance to loan ratio. Our current threshold is anywhere from 25 to 30% maximum CELI to lend out on any given time. We understand the necessity, we understand the urgency, and we understand that these are new times that we're living with and we are happy to help the city as best as we can. So therefore, we are recommending that the City Council approve the transfer of $75 million from the Public Works Trust Fund to the city's general fund emergency pandemic fund to assist the city in future obligations or any procurement needs for COVID response. One thing that I'd like to highlight, actually two things that I'd like to highlight. One is that we are recommending that this loan not be assessed a interest associated with this loan, simply because the interest that's earned in the Public Works Trust Fund, that interest goes back to the general fund. The General City Purposes Fund earns interest, and that money goes back to the city's general fund. So ultimately, that interest goes back to the city's general fund. Therefore, we are asking for an approval of the waiver of interest assessment to this loan. And last but not least, we did recommend to our board to proceed with caution because the $75 million would exceed our 30% balance to loan ratio policy or practice that we have. Approving this loan would increase us to 80%, puts us at about $114 million in loans that would be outstanding. That only leaves us about $29 million in working capital. Typically, we recommend only 25% in working capital. That's about $35 million. This would actually reduce our working capital by about $6 million. I'm not too concerned at this time, or the Board of Public Works is not too concerned at this time regarding the working capital area. However, I did want to highlight it because at any given time we could be asked to refund any bond that is guaranteeing any of the projects. Those bonds can go anywhere from $1 million up to $10 million. So if we were to receive a request for an exoneration or a refund of $10 million, that could happen at any time. We would have to have that liquidity available at any time to refund that depositor. Again, we do transfer about $8 to $10 million every year out of the Public Works Trust Fund for B permits. We also refund about $6 million every year to depositors. So our ins and outs are typically anywhere from 15 to 20 million per year. Again, our working capital will go down to about $28 million. So it's cutting it very close. We are asking the board and the mayor and council to proceed with caution, but we believe that this is a calculated and a good risk to take. We are also aggressively trying to collect any funds from any of our outstanding loans to decrease our balance to loan ratio and also increase our cash liquidity. In short, I'll end with that we support this request. We support the waiver of the interest. We are recommending that the City Council, your committee, recommend to approve the transfer of this $75 million from the Board of Public Works Trust Fund to the city's general fund. I did forget to mention one thing, and that is the time to pay this back for the loan. We are estimating anywhere from 12 to 18 months to repay this loan for $75 million. The reason why we're extending this to about 18 months is because our understanding of the refund process or the reimbursement process from the CARES Act is that city departments will have to submit their expenditures to the CAO's office. The CAO's office will then put together the request for reimbursement of federal grants. That grant funding process will take about 3 to 6 months before we receive that money back to the city, and then after that, the city can then go ahead and transfer or repay that loan back in increment portions. So therefore, we believe that it can be, the first payment can come in as early as 4 months from now to 6 months, but the entire loan would be paid off no later than 18 months. And with that, I will open it up to any questions that your committee may have.
Thank you, Dr. Campos. Yeah, I mean, this is something that ordinarily would be a very unwise thing to do, but given the extraordinary situation that we're in with our finances, you know, it's something that we have to do. I worry about it in terms of the balance, the ratio. I worry about it in terms of getting paid back timely. You know, FEMA can take, I hate to say it, but you know, decades sometimes to pay back. You know, we just finished getting paid back from the Northridge earthquake in '94. You know, obviously the CARES is going to have to go faster, but we don't have a choice. This is something we have to do to keep our city solvent, and we have it's an appropriate thing to do, as much as I don't like it. So with that, any questions? But I'll recommend that we move forward with it, that we keep a close eye on it, and try to make sure that we keep our balance ratio as strong as we can keep it, and get at least some initial reimbursements as quickly as we can. Any other comments or questions?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Farrell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Campos, thank you so much. Do you expect this to be fully reimbursed by FEMA? Because you also mentioned reimbursed with alternative sources.
Yeah, great question, Councilman O'Farrell. One thing that we are recommending to the mayor to utilize these funds for the FEMA reimbursable allowable portion, which is the 75%, and then having the city identify the matching requirement using other alternative sources. So therefore, this loan portion would be fully reimbursable. If the city opts to, or if the mayor, CAO, whomever is making the decisions opts to use this $75 million for all expenditures, then only 75%, my understanding, only 75% would be reimbursable through FEMA CARES Act. The other 25% would have to be identified through a different source. So again, we are recommending to use the 75 for the 75% reimbursable portion so that this full loan can be repaid back to us.
Thank you. And can you give us a verbal list and perhaps report back with an itemized list of all of these services? Does it include reimbursement for testing sites? I mean, it's a lot of money, but it's an unprecedented pandemic, and you know, so we have to deal with it, obviously. But it's a large outflow of money and high costs. So, do we have a full accounting of those costs?
I will be more than happy to work with the CAO's office, the mayor's office, to have that listing, the detailed listing, so we can report back on those itemized expenditures, if you will, that are going to be submitted. I understand that we do have a citywide listing of all the expenses that are currently being incurred by departments, and then once everyone submits it to the CAO's office, they consolidate that list. So I'd be more than happy to work with them and get that back to this committee.
I think that would be very helpful because we don't really ultimately know what the feds are going to do in terms of the Congress, in terms of more relief or not. We know we have the COVID fund that we've received. We know that we have to be very nimble with what allocations we approve and for what purposes. So I just want to get a better sense of all these moving parts and expenditures so we can have a conversation about priorities. That's where I'm going with this. So I appreciate that and look forward to the report.
Absolutely.
Great. Any other comments or questions from the committee members? Seeing none, I'm going to recommend that we adopt the recommendations in the Board of Public Works report that was adopted by the Board of Public Works on July 17th, 2020, relative to authorizing a Public Works Trust Fund loan for COVID-19 emergency response. Ms. Kidd, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Chair, would you like to include the additional recommendation for the report back?
I have to come back out. I have to do the same stuff.
Still on, guys.
This vacuum didn't get any.
Mr. Chair, would you like to include the additional recommendation for the report back?
Yes, please.
Okay. We'll take the vote to approve the Board of Public Works report dated 7/17/2020 with an additional recommendation for a report back regarding expenditures. Blumenfield?
Blumenfield, aye.
Ruth?
Aye.
Buscaino?
Buscaino, aye.
O'Farrell?
Aye.
And Councilmember Lee is absent.
And your lunch bill and your backpack needs to be in the laundry room.
Okay, well then, I believe that is our last item. Does that conclude all business for the committee, Ms. Kidd?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Great. With that, thank you everyone for the marathon meeting. Sorry about the technology issues at the beginning. Stay healthy.
Good work, all. Thank you. Good work.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks, Ms. Kidd.
Thank you all for your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you.